Hi there, so in this video we're going to look at price elasticity of demand and its relationship to revenue concepts in this third video on revenue. So to start off with, let's just recap our understanding of what we mean by elasticity, and effectively it's the responsiveness of demand to change in price. We're talking about price elasticity of demand. And we have a formula for this, so it's the percentage change in quantity demanded by the percentage change in price, and that will normally give us a negative answer because when price goes down, demand will rise and so on. And if the answer is between 0 and -1, then we have inelastic demand. If it's between -1 and -infinity, then it means we have elastic demand. And we can write this formula in symbols, as you can see here as well. So let's have a look at elasticity along the demand curve. Now, something that can be quite useful to remember is that along a straight line demand curve, we have varying elasticity. So although you might have seen this curve and thought, well, this is definitely an elastic demand curve, and this curve and thought this is definitely an inelastic demand curve, we'll see why technically that's not exactly true. So here we have a straight line demand curve, and I'm just going to put some numbers in so we can see what the elasticity looks like. Notice the gradient is constant all the way along that demand curve. So if you think that elasticity is based on gradient, you might think elasticity was the same all the way along the demand curve, but that's not the case. So here's our first point. So point A, we're at a price of £100 and we're selling 1 unit. We're going to move from point A to point B. So we're going to drop the price by £1, increase the quantity to 2 units. So plugging that into the formula, the percentage change in quantity demanded, that's gone from 1 to 2, so that's plus 100%. And the price has dropped from 100 to 99, so that's minus 1%. So we have 100 over minus 1, which gives us an elasticity of minus 100, which is extremely elastic. Then let's have a look at point C here. Now you can see we've got a quantity 100 and price £1. We're going to move to point D, so we're going to double the price. So the percentage change in price is going to be 100%, but the quantity is going to fall by 1% in this case. So we're sort of using the same numbers, but the other way around. So you can see that as we plug it into the equation, and we've got minus 1 over 100, which gives us minus 0.01. So that's very inelastic, and yet we're on the same curve with the same gradient. So elasticity can't quite be about gradient. And as I was saying, elasticity varies along any straight line demand curve, all the way along it. And what will be true about any straight line demand curve is at the very top, you're effectively as close to infinity as you can get. Right in the middle, elasticity will be 1. And at the other end, elasticity will be 0. So I should say minus 1 and minus infinity. So you've got the entire range of elasticities all the way along the curve there. So what's up with these demand curves that we saw initially? We're saying that's an elastic demand curve, that's an inelastic demand curve. And in fact, that elastic demand curve, that's an elastic segment of a much longer demand curve that goes from axis to axis. You can see that that's part of the top half of a demand curve. Our inelastic demand curve, that's an inelastic segment of a demand curve, again going from axis to axis. It's on the bottom half of the demand curve. So that's why if you drew that curve and said that's inelastic, yes, that is an inelastic segment of a demand curve. So just be a little bit careful about that. Okay, let's remind ourselves of our elasticity revenue rules. So firstly, demand's elastic, we lower price, revenue goes up, we raise price, revenue falls. The way to think about that is if demand's elastic, people are responding a lot to the price change, so we lower price, getting less per unit, but that's more than made up for by so many more people buying our product. Whereas if we raise the price, we don't get that, we lose quite a lot of sales rather, so that doesn't compensate us for the little bit extra we get per unit. Conversely, if demand's inelastic and we lower the price, we do sell a few more units, but that doesn't make up for the lower revenue we're getting per unit. But if we raise price, only a few people stop buying the product, and that's not enough to not counter the big increase in revenue we get from having raised the price and still selling the majority of the units that we were selling before. So let's relate this then now to our demand curve and look at the diagrams that we saw in the last video. So there's our demand curve with the range of elasticities all the way along it. The top half is elastic, the bottom half inelastic. Elasticity is 1 exactly in the middle. Exactly in the middle of that demand curve is also where marginal revenue will cut the bottom axis. Remember, marginal revenue is our change in total revenue when we change output by 1 unit. And you'll remember from the last video that marginal revenue is always twice as steep as average revenue. So it will cut the bottom axis exactly halfway along from where average revenue, our quantity for demand, when price is 0. So that being the case, that means exactly halfway along the demand curve at that quantity, that's also where total revenue is at its maximum. If we lower price beyond that, in the inelastic section, we lower price, then we're experiencing negative marginal revenue and our total revenue is falling. So you can see how this ties in with the elasticity rules above and what we've learned about revenue and revenue curves. We can also illustrate it by looking at total revenue boxes. So let's have a look at that here. So here we've got our demand curves that we'll experiment on. So firstly, let's have a price in the elastic section, and we're going to lower price still within that section. And the coloured boxes there, the revenue we get from each case. So we had the yellow box at P1, Q1 and the purple box at P2, Q2. So now let's label the boxes, and that yellow box we could say is made up of those two segments, A and B, and the purple box at price P2 is A and C. Did our total revenue go up or down when we lower price from P1 to P2? Well, box A is common to both sets of revenue, so let's just compare box B and box C. So box C by inspection is bigger than box B, so by lowering the price our total revenue is increased. If we started at P2 and raised the price, we'd gain box B but lose box C and our total revenue would fall. Let's have a look at it on the inelastic section of the demand curve. So there's our initial revenue at P1, Q1, so P1 times Q1 gives us that area, that revenue. We lower the price to P2, and again we'll label our boxes A and B for the first one, and then A and C for the revenue at the lower price. We lower price and it's inelastic demand. We gain box C, but we lose box B, that massive box B, so our total revenue would fall. Remember, that's what we expected to see from the diagram previously. So how can we use this? Well, one thing to think about is that actually also as we lower price we're also lowering elasticity, and as we raise price we raise elasticity, which is interesting. So you're moving on to more elastic or less elastic segments of the demand curve. And an implication of this might be, for example, a tax on something with inelastic demand, for example petrol, will eventually have significant effects on quantity as you raise the tax further. So you might have often say, well, there's no point putting a tax on here, but it is going to depend on the amount of the tax as to how effective it will be. So you might make a point in an essay, so a tax on petrol will be ineffective at reducing externalities as demand's inelastic, though it will raise a lot of tax revenue for the government which can be spent on, etc., etc., etc. That's fine. And then your counterpoint, therefore, might be, though, but if the tax is high enough, though, we might start to see significant decreases in consumption. As we raise it further, this might also reduce government tax revenue as we move on to more elastic sections of the demand curve. So that's our video, third video on revenue, and that's the end of revenue. So I hope you found those useful.